everyone. Welcome to this panel on deep tech. We will be exploring how deep tech things are changing in India and how entrepreneurs here are solving for the global problems. Quick reintroduction, Arvind Lakshmi Kumar. He is the founder of Tonbo Imaging, one of the first deep tech companies to come out of India. Prashant, who's founder of Cure.ai, very front-running healthcare AI company doing global business, and Srinath, who is founder of Agnicool, and he is doing 3D printed rocket engines, which is a story of its own. And the entire session will be anchored by Vikram. I think he doesn't need any introduction, but he probably needs a reintroduction because people still associate Vikram with NDTV. He's no longer with NDTV. He runs his own company called Editor-G, which is actually an AI-based news channel, which is very interesting. And we'll love to hear about that as well, Vikram, as we go along in the session. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Vikram, to take over the session.
Thanks, Manish, and appreciate the reintroduction, because a number of times I have people introducing me as a television anchor, and I say, hey, don't blame me for what's happening on TV news. I have nothing to do with TV news. I've had nothing to do with TV news for a while, so appreciate that. Thanks a lot. So, look, it's an absolute fantastic to have a panel like this. Each one of them is doing real cutting-edge work, and I would actually introduce each of them and ask them to talk a little bit about their individual businesses, and then perhaps take it from there into a more freewheeling discussion around deep tech itself, where deep tech is going, what is happening in technology, where India stands with the rest of the world. Are there things that we need to do different, or and basically look a little bit out of the future, what's happening 20 years from now? Will there be the singularity and all of us will merge with AI, or is it going to be a slightly more boring future than that? I mean, if it's a former, then we don't really need to worry about too many other things. So let's see which way we are actually going. So great to have all of you with us. I'm not going to talk too much more right now. Why don't I just start with coming to each of you, one by one, and getting you to talk about it. So Arvind, why don't I start with you, and maybe, as I said, a couple of minutes in each of your individual lines of business. So the work that you're doing in imaging, now I'm aware that a lot of what you do is also in the defense sector, so I'm not sure how much you can talk about it. But tell us, imaging, AI, what are you doing? How are you changing the world?
So hi, Vikram. So one of the things, a lot of people, just like you, they talked about reintroduction about you not being at NDTV. We are not a defense company, right? Everybody associates us as a defense company because a lot of our customers traditionally have been defense customers. And so I keep telling people, look, I'm not in the dhanda business. I'm not doing defense, so I'm not a defense broker or I make defense products.
You're not an arms dealer?
I'm not an arms dealer, right? So a lot of people do mistake.
We're going to drop him off this call, man. What is it?
So I do have a lot of interesting arms dealer friends whom I'm acquainted over the period of time, but I'm not an arms dealer. So, what our fundamental thesis is, as a company, we essentially build technologies to enable autonomy across a range of industries, right? And the goal is essentially, how do you assist, augment, and replace humans from dangerous, mundane, and repetitive tasks, right? So irrespective of which business you are in, and if you look at a large number of industries, right, defense just being one of them, transportation, space, agriculture, industrial automation, each of these industries is being right now transformed to be autonomous, largely because it's been driven by better need for better safety, security, and efficiency. And our goal as a business is how do you build these fundamental technologies to enable automation across all these industries. And among all these industries, the first industry we chose was defense, because what's the better use of automation if not allowing people from saving people and preventing them from getting shot, right? So we said, let's use defense as a beachhead, build these technologies for autonomy, and then move it to other industries. And so what we build is fundamental technologies to enable autonomy through better seeing, better processing, and better communication.
Right, that's fascinating. And imaging obviously is going to be central to that. And the problems that are being solved out there, defense, yes, we're seeing some of that being used in space. Obviously, once autonomous driving and all comes in, I guess there's going to be a further requirement for a lot of that.
Correct. So when you look at, so right now, a lot of the innovations which have happened in imaging have been in the visible spectrum, right? So what you can see with your naked eye, right? Essentially 400 to 700 nanometers is where all the innovations has happened. And innovations have happened there because that's been driven by the cell phone, right? So, the number of cameras which have been put on cell phones have essentially increased exponentially. So a whole lot of innovations in terms of having 3 camera systems, having depth cameras, doing low light imaging, all of it is focused on the visible spectrum. So what we focus on is what you cannot see in the short wave, mid wave, and long wave, because that's where you can see through fog, see through smoke, see through camouflage. And all real world applications require sensing beyond the visible spectrum. And our focus is what kind of innovations need to be built in sensing beyond the visible spectrum.
So just to take that a little bit forward, I mean, obviously we can see where the defense implications of that would be there in night vision, for example, which is one of the things that you've been doing. Eventually, I mean, this is one of the areas where human limitation kicks in, right? Humans can only see in the visible spectrum, but the minute you're going to AI and other sources, maybe you can see better. Are you finding that sometimes it's easier to look at things or to visualize things outside the visual spectrum? Is it better? Is it easier?
It definitely is easier fundamentally. So there are two parts to it, right? One is the challenge of imaging beyond the visible spectrum from a technology point is definitely more challenging because you need to build better sensors, different optics, the image processing changes completely, right? But if you're able to essentially get the kind of radiation information beyond the visible spectrum, everything from self-driving cars to drones, you're essentially going to be able to penetrate a lot more because ultimately it's just a physics limitation, right? So you have a longer wavelength, you can see farther, right? So you have fog, you have smoke, you have rain. So self-driving cars with today's technology, including the 1550 nanometer LiDAR, cannot see in all those weather conditions. But if you can democratize the long wave infrared to be substantially more mass market producible, then you essentially can apply it across a range of industries. And what you can really do is, see in all these conditions where when weather is bad, when weather is great, lighting is good, visible cameras are fantastic, right? I mean, they'll do whatever you need to do, right? But the moment you look at adverse weather conditions, you need to go beyond the visible spectrum. And that's where we believe a lot of the next generation innovations will happen.
Okay, that's really fascinating. We'll come back into more of that. And of course, everyone can also post their questions and go into some of this in greater detail. Prashant, why don't I come to you next? Because obviously one of the areas that has been spoken about a lot when it comes to deep tech and specifically when it comes to practical applications of AI in people's lives, healthcare and health is one of the first things that comes to light. So why don't you share some of the really exciting work that you're doing at Cure AI and where do you see that moving ahead?
Absolutely. So I run a company called Cure.ai, and we are a 5-year-old company focused on AI in the radiology imaging space. So what we do is we automatically interpret X-rays, CT scans, MRIs, identify whether they're normal or abnormal, detect specific abnormalities on the radiology image, and mark out the abnormal region for the doctors to identify, so doctors can see the results that the AI has generated. Now, this uses machine learning, deep learning underneath the technology to be able to interpret these images. And as you see, with AI, it requires a lot of data to train. So we have trained these algorithms on some 8 to 9 million images, X-ray, CT scans, and MRI, which have gone into training these algorithms. And they're extremely accurate now, validated by the likes of Harvard Medical School or Mayo Clinic, several hospitals in India. And today, these technologies are CE certified, FDA cleared. And we are in about 35 countries right now, processing about 10,000 plus scans on a daily basis from about 350 hospitals or so. So that is where we are. And so I'll pause here.
If I may just have one follow-up question, I'm taking off from what Arvind said, that sometimes the AI and other systems have advantages over humans, right? So like you said, you can go beyond the visual spectrum. In many ways, are you finding that the algorithms or the AI systems can do better than a human doctor because maybe they're picking up things that humans are not being able to see? It's too small for a human to detect. Or is that already starting to happen?
So that is starting to happen. So here is what happens, right? Human beings, their attention is not always the best, right? So especially on X-rays. If you look at X-ray imaging versus CT scans or MRIs today, X-ray is a very old form of imaging. It's about 120 years old. But it's still very common. There are more than a billion chest X-rays alone taken every year. So a massive number of X-rays, but they're not reported all the time. In India, for example, if you go to a hospital, you may not get the X-ray reported by a radiologist. You will get that film and they will ask you to take that film to the physician. You'll take that, you'll do that, and the physician will look at that, right? In UK, for example, X-rays are reported by radiographers. So if you have the best radiologist looking at the X-ray all the time, they will not be as good, probably. But because, you have not always a radiologist is looking at the X-ray, And in India, for example, there are about 15,000 radiologists for a population of 1.3 billion, while US has 3 times the number of radiologists for a population which is 1/4 our size. So again, it's not that US has a lot of radiologists, even that number is low because the number of scans is increasing exponentially. So what we do is we augment the radiologists, we augment the general practitioners, we augment the emergency physicians by providing this. We of course cannot report an X-ray or a CT scan automatically today because you still need a physician to sign off on it. But reality is, I mean, because AI is reporting something prior to the physician reporting it, they can actually do a better job at it because you already have a pre-read which has been done by a very systematic, methodical system, which is looking at all the abnormalities. And this is exactly one of the problems we are solving is lung cancer, early diagnosis of lung cancer. So what happens a lot of times is when you go to a doctor when you go to a doctor with symptoms like fever or cough, they would suspect it to be a COVID-19 or a TB or a pneumonia, flu, could be anything, right? But they will take an X-ray for that and they will identify the immediate infectious cause. But if there was a nodule on the X-ray, which could be indicative of lung cancer, that is missed a lot of times. In fact, about 1/4 of the times that lung nodule is missed. And lung cancer is one disease where if you identify it early, the survival rate is about 65%. If you identify it 1 year, 2 years later, the survival rate is 5%. So you can actually increase that from 5 to 65% by using AI at the point of care, at that time interpreting the X-ray to make sure that that nodule is identified and reported so that you can do follow-ups for lung cancer. So that is how we are supporting the radiologists and the physicians.
So if I can just take that a bit forward. I mean, once I was looking at a Watson demonstration in San Francisco, and the point they made is very similar to what you said, that there are some very remote possibilities that sometimes humans will not think about, right? Because it's such a 0.01% possibility right now. But because an AI system can automatically scan all medical literature virtually while looking at that one particular report, you can find or you can think of some really crazy outcomes. And they were giving a demonstration, for example, of a kid who was unwell and the child had Kawasaki disease, which normally you wouldn't think about, but Watson could think about it for the simple reason that it's trained to think about everything. Are you starting to notice that? These remote possibilities is really where you should almost always double check about what a human is saying with what the AI system is saying to rule out low probability.
So so I will not say that we are there yet because again, see, when there is a remote possibility, the probability of that is very small. And especially for these machine learning algorithms, which are trained on existing data points, it may not learn that possibility. So think about it this way, that we've got 3.5 million X-rays which have gone into training the algorithm. Of that, maybe some condition is only there on 10 X-rays. Now the algorithm will never be able to figure that out on its own, right? So we have to do something again for 10 X-rays. It's probably not possible for the algorithm to do that. But the reality is that if you look at 30 conditions, today we do about 30 conditions on the X-ray, that is way more than what a human being would look at. So it's not that 1 in a million case that we're looking at. We are still looking at a 1 in a 10,000 case, but that is also still very useful because that is something which not everybody is looking for. I mean, there are so many X-rays where you might just be reading. I mean, a radiologist would read probably, 30, 40 X-rays in an hour, and they're going through that very, very rapidly, and they may not necessarily notice some of the findings on the X-ray. So to answer your question, I would not say we are able to find that very sort of outlier case. Probably not there yet.
Okay, that's really interesting. Srinath, you're doing some really, really wild stuff. So why don't I first get you to just tell us about it? I mean, being a rocket scientist is one thing, building rocket engines is another, but using 3D printing to do it, why? And
Sure.
what and how? Tell us about it.
Sure, Vikram. Hi, my name is Srinath, one of the co-founders of this company called Agnikul Cosmos, where we build, rockets that take small satellites to space on demand. So in case you're wondering why anyone would do this beyond being, a rocket enthusiast, what has happened over the last 15, 20 years is, satellites have really shrunk in size. And I don't know how usually people think about rockets, but at the end of it, it's basically just a transportation system. It's taking stuff from Earth and putting it in space. So in some sense, it's just a transportation business that what we're trying to do here. But that said, there are some complications. There are stringent margins. It's tough. You need to basically operate just at the point where physics has allowed us to operate as a species, right? That is what you need to do to get something in space. So that is why it's fascinating, and it opens up a lot of things in a lot of areas. So coming to what we are doing, as satellites became really small, the vehicles that are carrying them, the rockets themselves, still continue to be large. So people started doing some sort of a ride share, right? Because it does not make sense to have one satellite, a small satellite, ride a very large rocket. People said, hey, let's come pull together, do a carpool to space. That's what people started to do. But then people quickly realized that it's not as efficient as, I mean, first of all, even on ground, it's not very efficient, but it's worse in space because there's a lot of other, nuances going on when you want to ride share with people. People don't want to go to the same place, for example, and people don't want to go at the same time. And worse, there is a bit of exclusivity here. Not everyone wants to ride along with everyone else. They're afraid, they might get damaged and so on and so forth. So the end result of all this, small satellites take about anywhere between 6 months, maybe 3 to 6 months to make. But to get it to actually to space, it takes about more than a year or maybe even 2 years. So that is where we thought, okay, why not build a small rocket that sort of looks like a cab that goes to space, right? And that is where the whole idea started. 3D printing, you asked us about that. The reason why 3D printing makes sense here is if you look at what is the most complex part of a rocket, rocket engines are the most complex and most involved manufacturing wise, at least in terms of making it. And rocket engines take a lot of time to make. So what we thought is, everyone is talking about 3D printing. People are trying to put lesser number of parts, make it one part and so on. Why don't we push it to the extreme and try to realize an entire rocket engine in one shot? So we kept pushing the boundaries there. First we reduced maybe 50 parts to one part, then 100 parts to one part. And finally, what we've realized now with the team is a single piece of a hardware that comes out of a 3D printer that can directly be assembled in a rocket as an engine. So that is one of the things, because you mentioned 3D printing, I'm mentioning that, but that is one of the ways in which we believe, you can basically get someone to space within a 2-week time frame. That is what we are really targeting for. If someone wants to, from the time the satellite is ready and they approach us, in 2 weeks, they should be able to go to space. That is what we're trying to solve for as a company. And that's what we're building.
But just to come back to the 3D printing part, and this is where we are obviously moving towards the frontiers of deep tech. If you'd ask me that, is it possible 3D printing? A lot of people still associate with little toys that you're printing out of in plastic and stuff like that. That's what you normally associate 3D printing with, even right now. I was actually astonished when I heard that it's even technically possible to do the 3D printing of metal in a rocket engine. And it's better than forging it. So if you could just talk to us about that, because I think most people in this chat would not realize that 3D printing has reached that level.
Right. And exactly, you're right. It started off like that, right? Making small plastic parts, making like toys, making small molds and stuff. But I think what happened with the advent of metal 3D printing is people figured out how to weld in a very systematic manner. And that is at least what we are using as a technology, right? It is basically laser welding done in a very precise manner, layer by layer. So where any 3D printing would work, and for people who are not totally aware of this, you just sort of you assemble the part layer by layer. You're growing the part. In some sense, I always am reminded of pottery. Like how we used to do it. That's exactly how it works. In some sense, you're actually shaping the part as it grows. What happened is, when people figured out how to move laser beams in a very precise manner in a particular direction at a particular point, people figured that you could just put a layer of powder and then weld in a particular manner, and then wash it off, put one more layer of metal powder, weld, and just keep doing this until you get your full size product. And this is now gotten to a point where people are actually able to get the material properties to match that of what you get in conventional manufacturing. Always, you need to go through the rigor of testing every time you print something, but there is enough, material research out there to prove that these material components that are realized from this sort of automated welding actually matches the properties of a conventionally made part. So that is what we are tapping into, and I think it's only getting bigger and bigger. When we started as a company, I think 2017, the maximum size that you could print was about 400 right, just about like a foot. Today we are already looking at 800 plus, and I think it's going to go to even 2 meters or so more. So I think this is growing rapidly, and it's going to be fascinating. People can start building like really big parts without even thinking of concepts like molding or casting or anything like that. Load a 3D model file into a printer, and it'll just give you whatever you want. That's where the world is going.
Wow, that's absolutely fascinating. One more question before I get Manish in. You know, one person's really successful business sometimes causes worries in other areas. So if what you are just describing, lots and lots of small rockets taking payloads up into space, I have heard some concern expressed around that, especially lots and lots of low Earth satellites and others coming. You have the cage effect. There's suddenly so much out there in space that launches become more and more difficult, and manned flights become impossible because you don't know what you're going to hit. There's too much out there in space. I mean, astronomy becomes difficult. It's not that easy to get out. And there is at least some doomsday theories that I've heard that if we don't find a way of regulating this, 10, 20, 30 years from now, mankind will be trapped on Earth. You will not be able to get out. Is that a realistic danger?
It is definitely a concern. I wouldn't say it's a danger yet because people have already started addressing it, right? So the way it works today, if you, let's say you want to put a satellite in space, people approach it really like a real estate problem, like orbital real estate, right? You're basically renting a toroidal shape, a cylindrical, a circle in space. You get to keep that for about 5 years. After that, you need to have something that will allow you to deorbit safely. So right now you're required to have a deorbiting protocol put into your satellite. Interestingly, this has been in the case for a long time in what they call geostationary orbits, right? So the concept there is if you go high enough, there is a particular altitude where the rate at which you are going around the Earth syncs exactly with the rotational speed of the Earth. So it gives you relatively speaking, you're exactly above the same point geographically. Now that is a very precious orbit, because if you put something there, it just stays there and focuses on what you want to focus on. And people quickly figured that there are too many satellites there, and that was getting too precious in terms of orbital real estate. So someone came up with this idea of what is called a graveyard orbit. I don't know if you've heard of that. An orbit that's slightly higher than the geostationary orbit, where when you have like about 2% of life left in your satellite, you sort of kick your way out into a higher altitude and you stay there. And that is not really commercially useful, but at least it'll allow people to come in and occupy this. So the concept of freeing up real estate or concept of being mindful of others coming in has always been there. Now they've started applying it to low Earth orbits as well, as opposed to geostationary orbits. Started off with the deorbiting protocol, and there are a lot of analysis now going on what is the risk of actually colliding into a debris and so on. And the one thing I do want to highlight is whatever people are saying is definitely true, but that's it. Space is really large. If you look at a sphere that is, about 600, 700 kilometers around the Earth, that is a lot of space. And though it looks crowded, there is still a lot of maneuverability around. But it's good that people are raising the right alarm bells, and that's why these things are also coming in.
Okay, that's absolutely, that's also really fascinating. Manish, let me get you in. So when you are launching, AI fund and looking at deep tech funds and the rest of it, there was a particular view that AI and AI related areas is where a lot of exciting stuff is happening. As we think deep tech is starting to grow, right? And that's something which we've often debated, whether it's all the excitement is in AI or other areas also where some really cool stuff is happening.
Yeah, I think I would say that a lot of areas which is cool stuff is happening, but I would also take a moment to see how AI has grown in the last 4 or 5 years we have been in the business, right? So in 2016, I remember my mentor, Subbuto, he actually asked me, okay, you want to do an AI fund, go and find an AI company of any substance. And we've looked around for a couple of months. We actually found a few companies working in AI, but we couldn't find a real good one. And then there was a huge debate, right? Whether we should do this or not. Looks like there is not enough to invest in. But we went ahead. And today you can see that there is hardly any company which is not doing AI. So that is the evolution of AI that has happened. And from a knowledge perspective, I remember, when I was pitching for the first fund, There are people who ask me, I know Air India needs money, but why are you raising money for Air India? And today, there are 2 articles on AI in paper today, right? Every day. So that is how people have moved in terms of their knowledge. So that is how we have seen AI maturing across different sectors. But to your point, in fact, we've backed Srinath, as you know, and we took a deviation from our thesis to look at other areas of deep tech because we felt that there are significant things happening around that. Just like data is a source of innovation in AI, I truly believe that material science is that layer which actually becomes the fabric for innovation in the deep tech space. So Srinath has talked about 3D engine, but there are lots of other innovation they have done around materials as well to make the entire rocket smaller. Similarly, there is a company in Bangalore which has created artificial cornea, which can be actually replaced in the human eye, right? So what we are seeing is that people are actually looking at other forms of deep tech, be it material science, be it nanotechnology, be it just core engineering. And there are some exciting problems which are being solved in that space for the global customers. And that's what keeps us exciting. In fact, our second fund, we're actually going to be focusing on that as well, in addition to AI.
One of the questions around AI, I mean, I think people, we probably passed the stage where people are confusing AI with Air India. It might be happening, but who knows? But there's still a certain amount of, if you talk to the general public, or you talk to a lot of people, there is still some level of confusion as to what AI means. Because when you talk to the average person about artificial intelligence, you're still thinking either in doomsday terms, which is Terminator, right? And Skynet is coming, and this AI is going to, sort of singularity type stuff that is going to take over everything and no humans will be left and it's going to wipe out everybody. By the way, it's a non-trivial concern. A lot of people have that concern, and maybe it's good to have that concern and talk about it, just as you're talking about being locked into space. That's at one level. The other, not really sure how is it practically helpful, and AI is not actually making any difference, and it's got no real practical significance. Too much training, humans may still do it better. So you keep hearing a very wide range of views as to what AI actually is and what it can do. So perhaps you can just talk us through that a little bit, Manish.
Yeah. Actually, the way we understand AI is very simple, right? So for us as humans, understanding language, for example, is very simple, right? We are talking easily with each other. For us as humans, it's very easy to see images and make sense out of it. But the same thing for computers is very hard, right? So one way of understanding AI is, can computers do things like human do? And in certain areas, do it much better because they don't have the attention deficit problem. So one way of thinking about AI is, can computers actually understand language? And that leads to the NLP branch of AI. Can computers actually understand video content and then make sense out of it? That leads to the computer vision part of AI. And can computers make sense of a lot of data from a statistical point of view? That leads to a data side of the AI. So these are 3 major pillars of AI: vision, language, and data, right? Most of the AI solutions are built around it. And the other way to understand AI is that most of the conventional algorithms that computers have been using are all rule-based. If X, then Y. If Y, then Z, etc. But humans don't think like that. We tend to learn looking at patterns, looking at things, and then try to make judgment out of it. So all these algorithms, can they learn from patterns instead of rules? And that unlocks a whole set of applications for AI to get plugged in and make disruptive changes. So for example, we have a company called Vyza, which is actually an AI therapy bot. So you can actually talk to Vyza as if you are talking to a human therapist, right? And it understands your anxiety, understands your emotion, and is able to respond responsibly to you. I think that is very difficult to build without AI. So that could be one way of explaining AI.
Okay, the depth in the Indian market now, AI companies versus other companies, what's your sense of it? And where is the most exciting work happening? Is it still AI? Is it biotech? Is it, like, what would be your sense?
I think we are, so first of all, depth of the market has increased. We meet a lot of companies. I think we recently did a data. We met 1,500 companies in the last 3.5 years. And out of that, around 1/3 of them, which is approximately 500 companies, are what we call as AI first or deep tech companies. What is AI first? AI first are companies which are solving problems which can only be solved by AI. Like Visa is a good example of that, right? It's very difficult to do that. And these are typically disruptive companies. So a lot of depth in the market across the board, we are seeing application of AI. But interesting to your point, right? We are now seeing companies like Agnikul, companies like Pandorum, which I talked about, artificial cornea. There is another company which is actually doing traffic management in space that I found very interesting to your point before this, right? So all these experiments are happening, and there is a whole spectrum of that happening in nanotechnology, in material science, in biotech also. We met a very good company which is doing liquid biopsy stuff, right? So people are actually pushing boundaries in all aspects.
All right, Manish, that's fascinating. I'm about to throw it open to everyone for a very free-reading discussion, and the rest of you can keep, putting your questions. We'll take them from the chat. But Manish, you had asked me, normally as a moderator, I just throw the questions, but Manish, you had asked me to talk a little bit about Editergy and what, why we decided to use AI to so in a sense, the idea for Editergy really came from I was interviewing Sundar Pichai once, and I was asking him the sort of question that I was asking you, that is AI overstated. He says, no, the AI revolution comes when people with domain knowledge start to use AI to disrupt their existing businesses. And that really got me talking because, and I think everybody in this group will probably agree, the television news business is not in the best of shapes. In fact, I normally ask people this question, how many of you think TV news has become unwatchable? And normally people all raise their hands and say, yeah, it can't be done. So that got me thinking, how do you change the video news business using AI and other related stuff? And it's possible to do because television is right now linear, right? So you're programming and you're entirely based on saying, okay, what are TRPs? How do I get my revenues from TRPs? And you have to program it to the lowest common denominator. And because you're programming it to the lowest denominator, that's where you have yelling and screaming and shouting and all the things that we love so much. The anchor shouting is even better than, and if you can get a tantric to yell at, then you're really in clover. So that's the way television news unfortunately works. Now, how do you disrupt that sort of a business? So one of the ways is that obviously these days everyone has got connected devices, so it's on their mobile phone. Now, if you can get the form factor correct, till now connected devices require you to tap on a particular story if you want to watch it. Now in news, that's painful. Who's going to tap on 30 stories to be informed? You'll do that for Amazon or something like that, but you don't want to tap 30 tabs to say, keep me informed. So we said, let's try and follow the music example, the Spotify and other examples, and create playlists of news stories and then customize them for people. But that brings up a very interesting question that I actually want to throw to all of you. The problem that when you start giving things entirely to algorithms, and we did that right at the initial stages, Manish, you were aware of that. It's very simple to build an algorithm which will say that, okay, we're going to now create a news list, which is the stories that you want to watch. And we did that. We did that very successfully, very easy. And traffic would be great because all the stories would be stories of interest to you. But is that keeping you informed? Not necessarily. Then you start coming to the problems of the social dilemma and other things that you are now in echo chambers. You're only seeing stories that are of direct interest to you, which means if something has happened which you should know about, a tsunami has hit somewhere, someone's about to press a nuclear button or something's happening, you're saying, I don't know about that. Why? Because the algorithm has said you've never shown any interest in North Korea, so why the hell do you care if North Korea is about to bomb the US or something else? So we had to, having built the system, we had to break it. And we had to reintroduce human control to say, no. Editorial priorities are important. Humans must get back into the system and try and build it. And that's what we are still sort of grappling with. And I suspect in the media and other businesses, you're going to have this entire question that can you give something entirely to an algorithm? Does its job really well from the point of view of metrics? But is that still the right thing to do because maybe you want to get the humans back into it. So we are right now playing around with a hybrid system where humans are dictating part of it, the algorithm, and there's a debate taking place between the humans who are saying, no, these stories are really important. And the algorithm say, yeah, but this guy doesn't care about the story and she really wants to see something else. So give them a mix of A and B. And that dynamic starts to play out. And maybe that's the way we're headed in general. So let me take that and throw it open to everyone else. Prashant, let me come in on that. Is that one of the things that you think is we're going to start seeing? That it's not necessarily going to be humans or AI, but some sort of a hybrid system where they work together in partnership? Or is that even feasible?
So, I mean, the 2 points here. First is that I think in news, right, what you said is very true, and figuring out how to get that right is important, because if you look at what's happening in the US, for example, I mean, around 70-80% of the Republicans believe that Donald Trump won the election,
Yeah.
which is, I mean, absolutely false, right? And the reality is, I mean, people still believe that because they are exposed to that truth. I mean, and what happened in Texas now with the power cut and all that, lot of Republicans in Texas believe that the Texas governor and Texas, I mean, they actually, the Texas state was actually cut off from the rest of the electricity grid for the whole country. And that was because of certain reasons, and the oil lobby and all that, right? And people believe that the power cut and all of that happened because of wind energy, which is only a very small part of the energy. So reality is that, I mean, people are exposed to what they want to see, and you don't ever see anything outside of that bubble. And
Yeah.
I think we have to figure out how to show people, and this is exactly happening because of Facebook and Twitter and everything else, right? Parler, and in the US there are all these other tools as well, which are all optimized to give you content you want to watch. And somehow we have to figure out how to get people out of that bubble, I mean, ideally, because you are looking for information and you're not looking for to be in that bubble all the time. So I think that's sort of, from news perspective, that is what I think we need to figure out. Overall, from a healthcare, because we are in the healthcare space, I operate in the healthcare space. There it is already, I mean, healthcare is something where you really cannot do autonomous stuff, because you are playing with human beings' lives. So everything in healthcare is regulated. You have FDA clearances required. There are regulatory bodies across the world for in every country. And so to actually sell a healthcare product in a country, you have to get that cleared by regulatory bodies. So that way, healthcare is something which is highly regulated. So we are in a space where we don't have to worry about the AI doing more than it is supposed to. Like, for example, similarly for autonomous driving, I mean, you've seen with autonomous driving, there were car accidents which happened because people stopped paying attention. And obviously, vehicle is really good. I mean, it's able to drive in most kinds of conditions, but there are certain conditions where it is not trained to be able to drive. And when the same can happen for us, right? When you give control to a radiologist and they see that, yeah, the AI is working so well that I don't need to pay attention almost all the time, then at some point, if the AI makes the error, that is still a radiologist making that error. So we have to figure out how to actually design these algorithms. It's not only about AI. We have to design that process in a way where somebody who is using AI is using it in a manner where they still have oversight of the AI. And it has to be human beings plus AI, at least for the near future. I think autonomous capability for AI could be in other areas, but healthcare, I mean, it's going to take a lot of time before AI can be autonomous there.
But Arvind, to that point, would you feel that that's something which is almost going to be a universal truth? You're talking about autonomous driving, certainly in defense, and I know you're not only a defense company, but in defense, all the more reason, right? People have this vision that once algorithms are deciding something, someone's going to just take a unilateral decision to fire missiles on another country or blow up some tank somewhere, and it's not going to happen. How concerned are you about this aspect of it? Human plus AI, human versus AI, how much control can you give an AI system?
So we build a system which is an autonomous weapon system, right? And there've been people who have had a lot of concerns about it. So essentially, it's a remote control weapon station that we make. What it does is it's a sentry. So think of it like you are at the border. You have the system mounted there. It has a 7.62 mm or a 12.7 mm gun mounted onto it. All it does is it tries to identify if there is an incursion. It tries to identify, is there a vehicle coming in there, identifies and tries to classify the vehicle, right? Is this likely to be a friend or a foe? It aligns the gun precisely at the vehicle and takes the vehicle out autonomously, right? So without having a human in the loop who says, okay, look, let me look at a target and let me try to aim and shoot. What the system does right now is essentially it aligns a gun, automatically classifies a target and takes out a target, right? Not too many takers of it. I mean, so we have this deployed on the West Bank, and there are a few people who are takers for this system, but there are a lot of people who are very worried about it, right? There are people. So there is still a human in the loop at times, where a human essentially has to do the final validation whether is it really a suspect or is it real? I mean, is it a possible a friend or a foe? Now, the challenge is what happens is a human is making that decision based on what he sees and how he can interpret that image at that given time, right? Which is also very subjective. And what the AI system in this particular case is doing is it's looking at a lot of metadata, saying, okay, where did the vehicle come from? Was the vehicle in close proximity with a bunch of enemy vehicles? Was it across the border? What is the trajectory of the vehicle? Try to through a lot of this meta-analysis, and it's not going to be foolproof. I mean, you're going to make mistakes here, right? But the objective is really to say, how can you minimize a lot of these errors, right? It's the same problem you have in an autonomous vehicle is, to think about, an autonomous vehicle which comes into autonomous operations, and let's say it brakes suddenly when it's not supposed to brake, right? And forget about anything else, right? It just thinks that, okay, what you're seeing on the, normally as a human, when you look at, let's say a tarpaulin has fallen there, you know that the tarpaulin is not terribly dangerous. I mean, sure, it is, you need to be careful and move away from it, but you don't need to brake as suddenly as if it's a vehicle or someone pushing a pram, right? But cars are likely to do that. Autonomous vehicles today are likely to do that, which means that the moment you brake, you're more likely to create a greater chance of an accident and a greater chance of a fatality than not braking at all, right? So some of these decisions are going to be hard decisions. There are going to be, I mean, as we learn through the system, especially for hazardous environments like military or industrial environments, where where your choice is between, do I protect a human by adding an autonomous feature, or do I risk killing a friend by adding an autonomous feature? That's a debate which is going to be there, right? And the question is that at some point when the benefits outweigh the risks, and in some environments they do outweigh the risks, in many environments it's very debatable. So I think it is a challenge.
No, so just to ask you, then I'm going to throw it to Manish. And by the way, I'm seeing lots of questions coming in. I'm going to start firing those questions in just about 5 minutes' time. We'll start taking those questions and putting them to the panel. So, Arvind, is the solution to say, let the AI, the autonomous system say, okay, look, this is happening. There's a tank coming. It's coming from a particular area. We're being able to do an X-ray through the turret to see that it's loaded. It's a really dangerous system. We think we should fire, but leave the eventual decision to a human, because it could be a political. We just heard, for example, in the Ladakh standoff, we heard the army saying sometimes it's a conscious decision not to press the fire button. And somebody took that decision at the latest standoff not to press that fire button, and probably averted a war and a shooting war. So leave the final decision to the human, the actual pressing of the trigger.
Oh, absolutely. I think a human in the loop needs to be there, right? I mean, it cannot, I mean, much as we'd like to sell more autonomous systems, in reality, it's just the ethics of it doesn't make sense to have truly autonomous system, right? A human has to be in the loop. The decision of, even if it's a wrong decision, that decision has to be made by a human and not by a machine in terms of actually, pulling the trigger. There are a couple of very interesting movies, right, where this entire dilemma about people, when they especially look at a UAV and you want to send a missile down at a place where, estimating a casualty versus probably taking out a terrorist. And humans would have a very subjective view with it, right? An AI system would say, look, the chance that the terrorist escapes and he's going to go bomb the next place where the casualties are going to be more. And AI would make a fairly impassionate argument that, yes, you need to do it, even though there is going to be collateral damage there, right? But I don't think I don't think we are there yet where we are able to say, okay, let there be collateral damage in the interest of the greater good. It's okay to make that decision right now. I think as a race, we are not there yet. It is a hard problem to agree to.
Manish, as a race, we're not there yet. It's also because AI systems are obviously becoming better and better, but they're not there yet, right? Look, if you look at the amount of change that's happened in the last 10 years, the last change that's happened in the last 5 years, certainly since the last AI winter, look at the amount that deep tech and and deep learning has gone. 10 years or 15 years from now, would most people feel, autonomous driving systems will take the decision better than humans, so ban humans from driving. Don't allow humans to interfere in the process because the AI system will do it better.
Yeah, absolutely. I think
it's illegal to have a doctor saying that I'm overruling what the AI has said, right? So, from Prashant's point of view, a doctor has to take the consultation, otherwise.
I think it would be a theoretical answer if I just say yes. I'll tell you one important thing that we have learned is how do you ring fence an AI system, right? And we learned that in a case of a fully autonomous bot called Vysa. Again, I'm bringing that example up, right? when I'm talking to that therapist, there are actually no human in the loop. There cannot be, because it has to be a real-time chat. You cannot have human supervising it and just kill the whole conversation itself, right? So there we've created a ring fence system where all outputs of that system are in safe zone, right? If something can be done, then you can do autonomous. So if a ring fencing is not possible and there is something that needs to a human to intervene for other reasons, then that human will be in the loop, especially in diagnosis, especially in weapon systems. But in self-driving car, I'm pretty sure that it's not even 10 years. I think 4 5 years, I think we should see a fairly autonomous cars, although they will say holy cow when they come to India on the roads.
Yes, I guess so. Okay, let me start firing some questions. So, Srinath, this one is for you from Akanksha. She says, can't tell you how exciting your work is. Since we've talked so much about AI in this session, I wonder where that would be adding value for a company like Agnikul. I mean, so we're just sort of trying to see that to other deep tech companies which are not necessarily in the AI space. Are you still looking at AI, or does it add any value or not?
Sure, and I think as Manish and probably even you said, right, it's slowly penetrating other industries as well. And so I'll tell you an interesting example of where AI might help rockets directly. The prediction of failures is something that AI algorithms are getting really good at. Now let us apply that to a rocket that probably is carrying humans, right? So a manned mission is obviously held to a higher rigor in terms of what the rocket's deviation from nominal performance is. If you usually around 1% tolerance in, say, efficiency or a thrust level, for a human mission, that's going to be 0.1% or something. So yes, you can probably tune your rockets over and over and over to a point where you get there, which is what people have usually done. But there is no active research going on now, because people have been firing rocket engines for a really long time, since 1960s. Right? Can we use all the data that is available to start predicting rocket engine failures a little earlier? So, and the interesting part is simulations have always been existing, right? So just to simplify that again, what does a simulation do? It tries to predict how a hot gas would behave in that, rocket engine's chamber or something, and tell you what happens, right? This is what typically people call computational fluid dynamics, CFD or something. But that is just because that is how humans looked at it. We had to come up with all this language of mathematics to explain how physics works, how nature works. But I don't think computers need to work that way. You give it enough data and it can statistically start predicting how things would look in the future as well. So I think I've already seen a couple of papers put out there today, which there is this, I forgot the name now, but I think the research is out of Cambridge, where they're saying that they don't even need CFD software as a whole to come up with a rocket engine design. All they need to do is give it a ton of previous rocket engine CFD data, and it is going to design the whole thing out of just AI. So that is one example of AI being used in the rocket industry. The other one being predicting failures early, so you can actually save human lives directly. That is one more thing. And outside of rockets, of course, once you get into things like using satellites for imagery or anything like that, immediately all of the imaging innovation happening in any other place also happens to satellite imagery, right? You can extend it there as well. But that's how AI is penetrating the rocket industry as well. Also heard of Industry 4.0, where detecting faults in parts that are being made in the industry through imaging, again, that can also be applied to rockets as well. So yeah, I think AI is making its presence felt very much in the rocket industry as well.
Okay, that's really interesting. Prashant's question for you from Ed, that is the AI interpretation of radiology images legally valid, and what are some of the legal questions around it? I mean, I guess that maybe a question others will look at also. Is there, and or would you also be looking at solutions that can address public health issues? And I think that's partly addressed by what you said, that it can democratize the quality of decision making, I guess. But what about the legality of it all?
No, so legality as of today in every country is that X-ray or a CT scan, MRI, any radiology image has to be reported by a radiologist. So AI can only augment their decision making. It can be a decision support tool, but it cannot fully interpret the image right now. So even if it fully interprets it, you still need a radiologist to sign off on it. So think about when you go do a blood test in a hospital, that test is fully automatically done. There is nobody looking at the microscope counting the number of red blood cells, white blood cells, and all that. That's automatically done by a machine, but you still have a pathologist sign off on that, right? So you could potentially get to a place like that where AI can do a lot of the reporting and then somebody is signing off on it, but it still needs legally, from a legal perspective, it still needs a radiologist sign off.
Okay, there's another question for you, which is a lot of startups mushrooming in AI imaging. How do you create a moat in this space?
So I mean, I think this is a very good question. So this is like building a moat in any startup. When you're talking about a moat, no moat ever lasts for a long time. So you have to keep on changing that moat over time. And for us, I mean, I would say initially when we started Cure, the moat was around the data that we had. We have still, I mean, it's still there. We still have access to a lot of data, and we have much more data coming out of India. We had a lot more data than our competitors in Israel or South Korea or the US. And so we had that data, and because we could train on a large amount of data, we could build really accurate algorithms. So that was a moat for us. And then as you are building healthcare algorithms, the FDA approval or the CE certification becomes a moat. Then your, I mean, engineering capabilities became a moat for us because we could actually deliver these solutions at scale. So rather than just doing research and delivering it, I mean, at 100 X-rays a day or something of that sort, we are now delivering it, 10,000 scans processed every day. So I mean, delivering that at scale, again, requires a lot of engineering capability, which we have now solved. So that became a moat for us. Now the commercial traction we have in certain geographies, the brand name we have built out becomes a moat. So I think, I mean, there is no one answer to that question. You have to think about what is finally, and the patents, of course, we have patents which can potentially be a moat, right? So there are several things you have to look at, but I would say initially, if you are starting out a healthcare AI company, data is the moat you should look at to begin with, and data in the space that you are trying to solve should be the moat.
Arvind, Bharat, throw the same question to you, because again, in imaging and other areas, how do you ensure that you've got a moat?
So I think fundamentally, right, so there are two parts. One is from a technology point and the other is from a business point, right? So typically what happens is when you look at, defense customers or automotive customers, these are long gestation period customers, right? Where you're spending reasonably enough time with the customer where the product gets inserted. So the customer does not change that product overnight for someone who's necessarily going to give it cheaper or just change the technology, right? So the industry is very different, where once you're spec'd in, you're there for a reasonable period of time. But as Prashant said, there is nothing stopping anyone with reasonable amount of money and reasonable amount of intellectual horsepower to be able to spend enough time to solve the same problems which all of us are solving, right? So there's nothing. I mean, it's just that you might solve it a little different. You might solve it better because you happen to think about a different perspective or your constraints or your capital. But anybody would do it. So fundamentally, the only way to build moats. I mean, and personally, I'm not a big fan of patents. I think it's one of the things when we realized, about 10 years back, was the way we learned about this business was mining other people's patents just to understand what are they really doing, right? So few companies essentially published everything, and we said, okay, let's just take everything and learn about it, because that was more so it's good as a defensive mechanism so that someone doesn't come and sue you. But I think the biggest thing has got to be about you saying, look, let me get products which a customer truly wants. Let me be in bed with the customer for a long period of time. And let me not, and I think this is not the case with AI companies or with deep tech companies. Let me not use investor money to buy customers, right? I think if you are doing investor money to buy customers and subsidize your cost to the customer, then tomorrow someone else will do that, and the customer is going to change and go to somebody else, right? But if you have built a product which fundamentally addresses a need, fundamentally access to certain technologies, like in defense, for instance, one of the big problems which customers in India or emerging markets have is access to non-ITAR technology, which is access to technology which is not restricted by the US government, right? Or by any other government. So if you're able to provide it to emerging markets saying, listen, I don't want you to, why do you want to settle for tier 2, tier 3 low-end technology? Let me get you high-end technology. That is a good value to the customer. And I think that's a good moat by itself, right? And the only way that moat gets surmounted is one of these companies comes in and says, hey, we are not ITAR restricted anymore. And then we can come and compete with you. So I think value to the customer can be the biggest moat which you can provide at this stage.
Okay, Srinath, let me throw, so Raja's got this question on the question of patents. So he said, is there, you might want to just unmute yourself, Srinath. Is there a framework you apply to decide what is worth patenting and what isn't? How do you assign a tangible value to a patent? What's your sense of patents?
Great question. So I actually, we are going through this process today as we speak in the company, right? So there are a couple of things. There is always this hesitation about putting out stuff there that, others might, in some sense, you might actually make it easier for people to incrementally innovate in what you've done and then legally prove that they are doing something different. But at the same time, the core of it is what you have provided. But at the same time, it does provide that a protection for a company to actually put out technology that has been developed in-house as a patent. So what we have done mostly is, so there is some of the stuff that even if you just put it out there, it's not going to be easy for people to replicate, particularly in the hardware business. Everything takes time. Even if literally exact design of something is out there, it doesn't mean people can replicate it and get what you have achieved, because there is always some nuance that is missing. It's exactly what happens when you read a textbook about how hardware works and then you go and try it in the lab, right? There is that 1% that's missing in textbooks, probably intentionally, and it is only you who has to figure it out. So on those cases, we've actually, come out, we've filed for a couple of patents already, but we're sitting on a lot more and still debating whether this is the right time as a company to put it out there for the industry, or should we go a little further ahead when we probably are at a larger scale, put it out there. That said, I think a core hardware focused company like us, or any hardware focused company, I think the real differentiator is going to be embedded somewhere in these patents, and how they release that information and how they work on that, adhering that to the customer, is how they're going to add value to themselves as a company. So that is how we have looked at it. Whatever we have put out there is stuff that even if people read it and actually want to do it, it'll be a 5-6 year timeline. But I think in today's world, 5-6 years is almost a century. So it's fine if people actually catch up on that after 5 years. So that's how we have approached the problem.
Okay, Manish, do you look at as an investor, do you look at the question of a mode, do you look at the question of patents? And I think Swati just put up this question, which is interesting. In India, you don't get patents easily for AI software, algorithms and all that can't actually be patented that easily in India. So in any case, there's a question around the value of patents.
Sure. I think we don't look for patent per se, but we do look for IP. Whether you have enough IP in your company, which is defensible, right? And have that tech mode. And then, as Srinath said, you could take a decision of what to patent and how to patent it, and keep some of this as trademark. I think on Swati's question, I think, Prashant, you may have to jump in. In my belief, you can patent algorithms. I think one of our companies, Niramai, already got an Indian patent for their algorithm. But as such, if you are doing software, there may be challenges. I think there may be a way to represent that in a form which can be patentable. Prashant?
We also have got a patent for our AI software in India.
Okay, so that's.
You have to show the linkage with hardware, right, in some way or the other to get the patent in India.
I guess so. Yeah, I'm not actually fully sure of that.
Okay, fine. Here's a question for everybody now. How do we ensure a deeper pipeline of innovation? How do you invest? How much percentage should you be investing in research? Is talent in India a bottleneck? And are you partnering with education institutes in India and or abroad? What means have worked for you to create your own independent research? It is a question from Sameer Sehgal, and I just want to add to that. This is something that sometimes, when somebody's looking at the Indian ecosystem, would cause some concern. If you look at the real, giant institutions of learning, I'm sure one of the reasons why Silicon Valley is, you've got universities like Stanford sitting in the middle of it, the same around the Boston, startup ecosystem. You've got universities that are churning out really great research. Is that still happening in India? The IITs obviously played a role, others played a role. Is it still happening? Or how do you ensure that there is a good pipeline of innovation coming in? Who wants to go first?
Happy to go.
Arvind, yeah.
So, I have a, there's a bit of a problem which we see here, right? And it's changed a lot by the younger crowd which is coming here, which is great, right? I think India has been one of those places where the value of the blind, with one-eyed person being the king, right? And the challenge and fundamentally the question is always about, you're building technology and you're saying, okay, look, my technology is good because I have an Indian customer who's bought it, right? the way to to ensure that we become more competitive, right, and rightfully with the right incentive coming in from the government and everyone is got to be about, it's just like publications, right? There's no great joy in publishing 100 papers in 3-4 random publications and conferences and journals, right? You take the top 5 conferences, look at your head score and say, look, am I there, right? I mean, am I publishing something which is truly peer reviewed, and are other people accrediting it, right? So your count of your publications doesn't matter. Just 2 or 3 great publications in those journals and conferences makes a difference. And the same goes for our IP, right? We've got to be able to look at technologies which we build and say, are we competitive enough in a global market? If you're building a product because someone in North Sudan is going to buy it because they don't have access to it from the US, or someone in Nepal is going to buy it, or the Indian customer is buying because Atmanirbhar and you're India, that's not a good reason to build something, right? Because then you're not competitive. You're just getting the advantage because you happen to be there at that place, right? So I think from a technology point, the emphasis is going to be that, look, if you're building an imager, it's not that are you building an imager which is better than what is built by Bharat Electronics, because that's not saying much, right? Is it, are you building an imager which you can go to Raytheon and Raytheon would be willing to buy it from you because it's the best imager at that price point for that configuration, right? And I think that's a mindset which we have to inculcate. And I think as investors or anybody who's coming in, right, the competitiveness about your technology cannot be, it can be local from a market point of view, because you have large markets in India. You might do market jugaad and market innovation, which might be local to you, because of which you might be attractive. That's fantastic. I mean, that's a good enough reason to invest. But if you're investing in a company from technology's sake point of view, the technology has got to be fundamentally defensible, right? Would it stand, if let's say, for instance, if you're building, and I'll take imaging as an example, and maybe rockets, is if you were to go back and say, look, I'm going to stand in front of SpaceX, NASA, or SPY, right, and I'm going to talk about my technology, are there going to be enough people there who are going to get up and say, hey, wonderful, I mean, this is great stuff, and we'd like to come in and partner with you, we'd like to work with you because we think you're truly innovative, right? And I think that's important. And if we unless we incentivize that behavior, it becomes very hard for people to break away from that loop, right? So I think it's got to be, I mean, you got to be globally competitive, and that's got to be validated by someone who's global truly.
All right, Srinath, the question of talent, are you finding enough talent? Is there enough of is the education system and everything else that we're doing throwing up enough talent, well-trained in these areas, or is that going to be an increasing struggle? Because frankly, if India is going to become an innovation hub, for the world, and we all hope that it will, that will be required.
Sure, great question. So I'll address it in 2 parts. One is the whole academia, relationship, and that has actually benefited us a lot. We right from the very beginning, actually, we have been incubated to the IIT Madras ecosystem, and that has helped us in access to lab facilities, access to right kind of people, and so on. Of course, there is this inherent. I've always seen this happen when recruiting IIT, particularly people who are finishing their bachelor's degrees at IITs. Either if they're really having a technical bent of mind and they want to do something which is on the engineering side, there is still that pull towards Stanford. There is still that pull towards the Silicon Valley, or Harvard or MIT or something, as opposed to staying in an Indian startup and doing something. And I initially thought it was because they are doing it because others are doing it, but I then, after talking to going through recruiting for more than 4 years now, I've realized it is actually that they don't trust companies out of India to do something well. So I think it is a little bit of an onus on the current set of entrepreneurs who are doing deep tech in India to prove to the community here that things will happen out of India. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, but I think we're breaking away from that. The other thing is in terms of the people who are trying to, it's always a little disheartening to see people, really, really bright engineers go out to, say, companies, I don't want to name anyone here, but because of the pay they're offering right out of, undergrads, right? Obviously, a startup cannot offer that. Of course, you can think of softer means of, compensating them through ESOPs or something like that. But that said, how do you go and, when you're 21, 22, when you're just outside of college, and you compare yourself with someone who's making 50 lakhs a year, and you're here probably trying to make 50,000 a month with a ESOP that is probably worth crores. So that is always going to be a challenge to break away from. And that is where I think the coolness factor probably helps. People should realize that, it is possible to do interesting stuff out of India if they're also a part of the story. One thing that we are very happy about in Agnikul which we as founders, me and my other co-founder point, really didn't think about. But another co-founder of us, Professor Satya Chakravarti, it seems like he always had this in mind, is that why am I teaching all these aerospace engineers when they want to go outside and do something? Why are they not doing anything out of India? Now we employ 60 people, engineers who are doing new innovative technology in India. So I hope more people like us, if they come out, more and more people will start staying back in. There's a bit of a trust angle and a bit of a coolness factor that is missing, which I think is evolving there though.
All right, question from Mr. Sehgal. Prashant, let me throw that to you, I think. On the question of ethics and legal liability issues. So one is the legal aspect of all that's happening. Are the ethical questions going to become more and more as we go forward?
I will address that. I actually wanted to address this question, Vikram. This is a very important question on talent because I mean, I graduated out of IIT Delhi and moved to the US for a PhD, and I lived in the US for 10 years. But if you go, I mean, today you go to a Google office or you go to a Facebook office, you go to any office in the US, a large number of people there are Indian folks, right? People who are from India, who have grown up in India, studied in India, gone abroad. And we can keep that talent in India. We just have to create a good brand. We have to do good work. We have to publish our work. We have to show people that we can do it. And we have done that at Cure. I mean, we have published our work in some of the top journals in the world. And we have to do that, and we have to create that brand so we can retain that, because that negative mindset will always be there. I mean, we have, as Indians, we have that mindset. I remember when we started Cure, I went to some doctors, and doctors said, why are you doing it in India? I mean, you've got American companies who are doing it, Israeli companies who are doing it. Why should you do it in India, right? And but that is where, I mean, this Atmanirbhar Bharat and all of these things play a role, because you have to, if you look at China, they have done that, right? They buy Chinese goods over goods produced in other countries, and you have to create some level of I would say, I mean, you have to protectionism around Indian products, Indian capabilities, and we need to think that way. And there is currently a lot of talent in India, a lot of great companies, like Manish pointed out. And as long as all of us think that we can do it in India, we can certainly do it. You have to keep on building that brand and keep on talking about what we are doing. And I mean, Srinath is doing amazing stuff. Arvind is doing amazing stuff. And Manish is investing into so many companies, right? And we should definitely encourage and talk about all of these companies. And the first thing that happens with us is that when we hear of a certain company doing something, we say that India mein hoga to fraud hi hoga, right? It's probably they're not doing it well. And that is a mindset across all of us. I mean, and we need to, I mean, and it happens to me also. I mean, somebody was talking to me, somebody called me and said, I'm looking at investing into this AI company. And my first thought was that maybe it's, I mean, they are probably, I mean, talking about it a lot. And it just feels like they are overselling whatever their capabilities might be. But that was the first thought. And I thought, maybe why am I thinking like that? If it was an American company, I probably would not have thought like that. So how do you change that around? And it's, of course, I mean, the perception will take a long time to change, but it is getting there. And today we are able to attract talent. We are able to retain a lot of that talent, which would go to a Bay Area or a Stanford or an MIT for a PhD. So we are able to retain them here in India. So definitely something that we can do. And coming to your question that you asked me, ethics, in AI, again, I mean, so because I mean, I operate in the healthcare space, it's already, I mean, there are ethics committees for everything. I mean, when you are even doing a study, you're doing a trial with a hospital, you have to go through an ethics committee, you have to go through an institutional research board. So a lot of these things are already very regulated and well managed in the healthcare space. I think ethics in other areas of AI is something is not very clear. So for example, when you look at Facebook, for example, what are the ethics in Facebook? I mean, they have an oversight committee now, which is an independent oversight committee. But again, I mean, how much should they control what you see? How much do they control information? I think, I mean, those kinds of things are, I mean, there's lots of discussions around these things. And I mean, when you publish, in fact, what happened with Google recently, some of the internal bias and ethics team members published something which was not in line with what Google wanted to publish. And so we saw a lot of people leave from that team in Google recently, Timnit Gebru and so many other people. So I think, I mean, it's I mean, honestly, I would say at least in my expertise, healthcare space, that piece is sort of very well defined, because I mean, healthcare ethics have been defined in the past through all the pharma companies and the hardware devices. So when it comes to what we are building, we are building a software device. So in many ways, all those same same rules apply to us, and we don't have to think so much about what that means. But I mean, if you were to think about it, I would say, again, I mean, if you look at pharma trials, right, you have to make sure that the patient is aware that they're part of a trial before you commence that trial. So same for us. I mean, we have to inform the patient. You have to get that patient consent before you use their data for training, or you use their data for a study, or even if you want to use AI in your interpretation, typically getting a consent is very useful.
Right, Manish, I think we're now starting to reach the end of this, but yes, I'm seeing a lot of debate taking place on the chat also around the entire concept of you taking a decision. For example, let's say, let's do a deep tech fund. So a deep tech fund better or a deep pocket fund better, and which should investors be? What should founders be looking at?
I think it should be answered by founders, not by me.
Yeah, okay. Let me ask you, what do you think are the advantages of a deep tech fund? And do you also restrict yourself by saying I only have to look at deep tech, only at AI, or something else?
So I think you got to put it in perspective of the capital raised, right? So maybe you guys started, I mean, each of us is at different vintages in our life. So maybe I think Srinath, you probably are the earliest or the youngest. I'm not sure, Srinath or Prashant. So maybe you guys start and I'll tell you my take on it as well.
Okay.
How much you guys raised, and maybe you should tell them that what do you see as the
the raising experience. So, but Manish, let me get you to first talk about the fund point of view, and I'm going to get the others to then weigh in on.
I'll tell you. See, my perspective is very simple, right? When deep tech companies are in the beginning, they are basically ugly and scary, for lack of a better word. And when Srinath presented to us first time, like we were all blown away, like what is it happening and what we couldn't understand. But something clicked in our head. We went 2 months, we studied it, and we found some conviction that this, what he's saying is actually is possible. It is not a fairy tale, right? And I feel that for that kind of decision making, you have to get comfortable with the deep tech and the risks involved when they're ugly. My job as a deep tech early investor, I sometimes think of myself as a transformer. So from a technology statement, can I make it a business statement with my association with the company? And then it opens up for every fund to look at it. But when funds which are typically not specializing in deep tech, when they come and look at the early companies, they are not able to recognize the potential and come to terms with the risk. That has been my experience in short.
Right. So, as essentially the question from Raja is also about which are the two different types of investors. Let me now phrase this moving from Manish to all of you. You can have a deep pocket fund, you can have a deep tech fund, or you can say, let me just get, like a strategic investor to come inside. And let me just share my point of view on that to some extent. When I don't know, some of you may know, we actually got acquired, 4 or 5 months ago, majority stake. And somebody said, why at this stage are you doing it? It's because there's a certain path that you want to follow. And sometimes VCs and Ps are facing a different set of metrics to the ones that you think is the right way to go. And therefore you say, okay, I would rather do it in X manner or Y manner. Is that something that plays in all of your minds? Arvind, okay, so let me start with you, then I'll go to the others. Is that something that is important from you when it comes to looking at an investor? Because sometimes an investor may say, look, I have these set of requirements and this is what I want to do, and I'm going to try and pigeonhole you into this box.
So there are two parts to this, right? So all the people we've raised capital from, right? The people I raised money from are largely value funds. Almost actually all of them. I mean, they have India, centers which do, look at opportunities in India, but they're all value funds with, capital in the valley anyway, right? Now the fundamental problem. So there are two things when it comes to the question. The first question about deep tech versus deep pocket, right? The thing about as a startup, right, and just and my experience over the years is that when you're not constrained by capital, you forget about being. I mean, you lose the consulting mindset, right? You are when you are constrained by capital, you're thinking so much about am I hiring the right set of people? Am I worrying about money? Because you just don't have the money to hire, right? But if you say, listen, I have an elastic checkbook. Today, you guys need 5 million, I'll give it to you. Tomorrow, when you need 50 million, I'll make sure that you have access to it. And day after tomorrow, when you need 200 million, I'll make sure PIF or SoftBank is there to back you up, right? you need that along your journey, right? And that is extremely important. And that also happens as a function of two things, right? It happens as a function of who ends up being your seed stage and your Series A investor, to also the people who come in later, right? Now, as an example, and as Manish should tell you, right? So if you are a series, if you raise your Series A capital, and let's assume that Andreessen Horowitz put in, or Sequoia put in their Series A money in you, right? And from the Valley, your chances of making a Series B investor from the Valley is much higher, and someone with much deeper pockets is much higher, right? Just the relationships and the ability to pull in that capital, right? So you want to make sure that you have, but on the other hand, you also want people who are deep tech focused, because you want people on your board who are adding fundamental value, right? I mean, you just don't want the money. You want someone with whom you're going to have a meaningful conversation and not have Excel sheets to show graphs and projections, right? So you want a mixture of one or two guys who are your deep tech mentor friends on your board, with whom you have an honest, candid discussion about saying, hey, listen, this is what I'm doing. Let's talk. Forget about the other BS. Let's just talk about the real stuff, right? And then you want the deep pocket guys who can actually make sure that you can paint it the right way from a business angle to get enough investors on board, because you need access to capital, right? Because without access to capital, you're going to be constrained about how you can grow. And if you really want to grow very fast, very quickly, you want to make sure that you have access to that. So I think it's you need to have both of them on your board as early as possible, and I think that is useful.
Okay, I think we are running out of time. So, Srinath, I'm going to get final thoughts from everybody leading off from that question or any other question that you want to address. Srinath, let me get some final thoughts from you.
So quickly on the previous point, I think, Manish summarized it quite well, right? Being able to see beyond that dirty early part of any deep tech company. I think for us, two things worked well. One thing was we were very clear on the technology we wanted to innovate on. We were not trying to figure it out or anything. We were already in the process of implementing it. And that's where an academia partnership helps. So that you can show a prototype and then convince people with the right mindset that, hey, we can build something out of it. So that is something. And also the other part is about involving experts at the right time. And that is right time is basically as early as possible. For us, we reached out to a lot of retired ISRO scientists, because ISRO has done a tremendous job, in space tech. Actually, when I came back from the US, I used to live there for 10 years before coming here for Agnikul. And one thing that actually got me really fascinated was, anytime I was not even an industry insider, like I'm not from an aerospace background initially. And whenever I told I'm from India and I spoke space, people just sat up and listened. And obviously that's not because of me, that's because the credibility India has. And that is about basically the experts we have in the country, right? So when you're doing deep tech, trying to approach investors, I think having academia, backing you in some sense, having the right experts, that's what helped us. And I think that would apply for everyone. Final thoughts. I think today we are at a place where even areas like space, which I really honestly thought in 2017 when we started is going to be extremely hard from a fundraising standpoint. We have been able to raise a couple of rounds. We are also in the middle of raising another round. Things are looking definitely much better. So I hope that people would see this, and not only us, obviously Prashant, Arvind and other people as well, and try to do more deep tech out of India, because that would give us more of a hold on the foundation of how we look at technology as we grow. So that would be my last thoughts here.
Okay, great. Prashant, last thoughts from you.
So I think, as I said earlier, there is a lot of deep tech work happening in India, and we definitely need to do a lot more. I mean, right now, when you hear AI in the newspaper, it's a lot of it is not necessarily deep tech. It's basic, simple algorithms, right? You're not really doing deep machine learning or AI to build that. So we need to do a lot more of true AI, like what Manish mentioned about Visa, or what a lot of other, now lots of companies in India are doing that. And that's one area I think we should focus a lot more on. As a startup, there are lots of opportunities for funding, so that if you focus on building the right set of deep tech products, there is funding available right now. That said, again, I think there is Series A, Series B funding available. If you are building a series, if you're building something which requires a Series C funding, you still have to go abroad for that funding, go to Bay Area, maybe Singapore. But that is where we are. But it's come a long way from where it was about 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and it's definitely trending up.
All right, so there's been a really, really fascinating discussion. We've gone 1 hour, 20 minutes. So Manish, I'm going to toss back to you for the last word and also for a closing comment. So from me, back to you now.
So one experience I wanted to share with all of you while building this fund, right? When we started building this fund, see, building a fund is like building a startup. You have to solve for fundamental problems. It's not like we have money and we can distribute and things will happen. It doesn't happen like that. So we had to solve for some fundamental problems. So one of the experiences I had, and I want to focus on two things, apart from a lot of other things that are out there. One is, if you take a problem and solve it 10x better using the technology differentiation, the market opens up for you. We have three panelists here. All of three are doing global businesses today, right? And we have lots of our companies. All of them are doing global business, and some of them are doing it very fast pace because they have a significantly differentiated solution to what is out there. So it doesn't stop you from wherever you are to do global business. Number one. Number two is, one of the biggest things I found very difficult to answer when I was fundraising, especially for fund one, is, okay, you can do the first check. Who's going to do the second check? Who's going to become follow-on funding, right? And and none of our companies have been funded by the usual suspects of Axel and Lightspeed and Sequoias of the world. In fact, what we have seen is that if our companies have even done 50% of what they promised to bring to the world, funding has automatically come. Our companies have raised $75 million in the last 4 months across 4 companies, Srinath being one of them, and a big Series C round right here in India, company has been able to raise. These are significant changes that we are seeing in the last 4 years, and therefore I just feel that we are absolutely the right place where deep tech developments in India with the capital and entrepreneurs, everything is coming together to a resonating point. And thank you, Vikram, for such a wonderful session. I think you moderated so well, but I would like to hear your thoughts about how you think the deep tech is coming together in India.
Just sort of final closing comments. I think, look, it should be clear and obvious to everybody that this is the way the world is moving to, right? It's clear. I mean, you can see it. Look at the interest. The best performing fund in the world for the last 3-4 years is essentially a tech fund, right? ARK. And we know what Cathie Woods and others are doing. Look at the sort of returns that's done. The world is changing faster and faster. Technology is going to move faster and faster, and exponential technology is here. And at the end of the day, I think for all of us in India to sort of sit back and see that while we spend a lot of our time and a lot of the headlines are spent on arguing about things that are not that relevant, I think the pace of change that you're seeing in the world is only accelerating, and it's accelerating faster and faster. The world today, you think that most of the innovation is over, right? When the cars came, the rest of the thing come. I think the most exciting phase for humanity is in the next 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. And I think technology and deep tech and exponential tech in multiple fields, not just AI, biotech, everything is going to change the human experience faster than we can, not only faster than we are imagining, but probably faster than we can imagine. So I think it's really great that we should try and focus everyone's attention on this instead of the usual thing that we spend all of our time arguing and fighting and spend TV headlines on, because I think the world's going to be a very different place in 10 to 15 years. So great to do discussions like this, and we should do more.
Thank you so much, Vikram. Thank you, Arvind, Srinath, and Prashant for taking out the time. And thank you all the audience. You've asked some very good questions. I hope we have been able to address all of them. Otherwise, just shoot me an email and I'll help get the answers from any of the panelists. Thank you so much.
We can take the questions in the next round.
Absolutely. We'll do one more after a few weeks. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.